Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast, where we celebrate filmmaking, storytelling and cinema across the island of Ireland. So whether you're a diehard film fan or simply curious about the screen industries, make sure to subscribe to Film Ireland so you can catch up on past conversations with creatives like Clinton Liberty and Joshua Oppenheimer. So in today's episode, we're delighted to chat with filmmaker David Gleeson, whose film Once Upon a Time in a Cinema is in cinemas on the 1st of May. Or if you'd like to watch a video of the original recording, check out the link in the description. But first, have a listen to the trailer here.
Film is delicate. Too much tension, it'll snap.
What we off?
This place is hell together with elastic bands.
We're threatening power cuts, Mr. Clancy.
And we're out of train.
We can't bring chips inside.
Tony Jelly.
A huge rat.
And all I hear from you is oil fixes.
This is looking great. It's a credit to you.
Conway is going to make a cash offer.
I have a number in mind.
This is fate. Forcing you to sell the place.
You're selling the cinema.
Trying to do what's best for everyone.
How would you know what's best for everyone?
Sergeant, they're killing each other across the street.
It's a bit of throw shit.
I watch everything on video anyways.
Get out now.
All this frustration, all this anger.
Stop it! Two brothers! Stop!
It's because you're afraid to let the cinema go, because when you do, you've nowhere to hide anymore.
Cinema brings them together for an experience that's so much more than the picture. That's why they come.
Showtime.
Powerful stuff.
Good night, lads.
Thank you so much for chatting with us. It's very exciting to have you here. Once Upon a Time in Cinema, it's such a warm love letter to classic cinema, to the people, to all those roles as well that supported cinema that were gone. I think one of your titles before, I'll always remember, I used to work in an Extravision, and it was we'd rent it out, and it's
Cowboys Angels.
yeah. Like when I looked it up, I remembered the cover from sitting on those little plastic containers that, you know, those walls of films, and it kind of does make you really nostalgic in that way. And so many people from the industry, you know, were projectionists or had different roles, or, you know, like, because I think in some way we all gravitate towards those type of jobs, and I think this film kind of captures that really well, and then captures the communal experience of what it used to be so beautifully. So I'm going to, and in a time conscious manner, kind of work our way up to talking about the film, if that's okay, because I think you're someone who's had a really, really interesting and varied career, and I was wondering if we can kind of go back to the past. And this is a story as well that obviously is close to home with the business that your family had, and I was wondering if you can kind of start there about yourself and your interest and your love towards film and storytelling, and how that was nurtured in that space, and tell us a little bit about that.
I guess if you're familiar with the $10,000 theory, you know, it's like you spend $10,000 immersed in your art, and you have the grounding to be able to master it, you know, like the Beatles did their time playing clubs in Hamburg, and Bill Gates, when he was a kid, his father brought home a home computer. And I did my $10,000 standing around various cinema foyers. And I never went to film school, but my film school was watching many, many movies over and over again. Some of the very best of world cinema, along with the very worst, and watching those films repeatedly, you know, so that it didn't matter whether the film was good or bad, but you would always learn something from it, especially when you were forced to watch it about 10 times, you know. Your brain would just scan for something to engage with, you know. So, you know, so I would concentrate on what the way the director was moving the camera, you know, and, ooh, I wouldn't have done that, I would have done this, you know. So I think I just absorbed, you know, so many different styles, and the movies that cinema release patterns were different, when I was immersed in that world, and that was in the late 80s and the early 90s, when a big release would play for maybe a week, just the one show, for 1 week. And that meant, that you could put on a double bill for a late show, you could play something else at the matinees, etc. And those release patterns changed. And that's also what kind of killed these small town cinemas, is that with changing release patterns with the growth of multiplexes in the 90s, studios insisted that all their big releases played every show for 2 weeks. So as you know, that's unsustainable in any place that isn't a big city, because after 3 nights, the population of your town has seen the movie, so who's going to go to every show for 2 weeks? So those changing release patterns kind of led to the death of small town cinema. But anyway, so I was exposed to a massive amount of cinema growing up. I kept a diary one year, and I went back and totted it up, and I was seeing an average of about 13 different movies in the cinema every week. And there were a range of I remember one of the best double bills we had that played on a Monday and Tuesday night was the director Bruce Beresford. One of his breakout movies, it was called Breaker Morant, and it was his breakout movie, and it played on a double bill with Louis Malle's Atlantic City. And that was just on a Monday and Tuesday night. But these movies wouldn't have been advertised as come see Louis Malle's latest movie. It would have been, Susan Sarandon gets her top off, in a thriller with Burt Lancaster,
In conservative, it's hard to picture that in conservative old school Ireland.
There you go.
Down with this sort of thing. Careful now.
You should check out my Instagram, the David Gleeson. There's a reel of actual movie posters that I put together, and you'd be shocked at some of the titles that were shown. Like, for instance, one of the really badly dubbed Italian movies, that was shown in a late show. Titles such as "Where Are You Going All Naked" was one. The first late show I was allowed to work at was a double bill of "Sex with a Smile" and "Blue Movie Blackmail."
Wow.
This is in 1980s conservative Ireland, and this is in a small village in County Limerick. And you drive in, and the first thing you see is the cinema, and it looks like a sex cinema in Soho or Times Square. Sometimes, I was about 14 and I used to cringe, I go, oh my God, my family owns this. Yeah, crazy, this complete dichotomy, I mean, if you had that cinema now with those posters up, I think my father would get arrested, so it was weird. But anyway, I digress.
But it's fascinating. And I think the thing that you touched on that I thought was really interesting is, you'd watch all them, you'd get to see what works and what doesn't. And I think the thing that's very, very interesting is when a film works, it's hard to break down, why it works. It's everything is sort of running together so smoothly, and you're like, this is just good. But when a film doesn't work, it's almost like there's, you can kind of break it down to the technical elements, and you can be like, okay, there's an issue with pacing, and then that affects the flow and things like that. Did you find like there were, one or two things, like specific examples of, films that, really gave you important lessons that you were to take on then as you were writing and then starting to direct your own work?
Yeah. I mean, the first movie that's just going back a little bit, the history of that cinema basically was the cinema in Capamore, which is where it began for my family. My grandfather was kind of an entrepreneur. He ran a harness shop, making leather harnesses for horses and stuff. There used to be like 4 of them in Capamore. And so he bought, and when the parish was electrified, German engineers used to travel from parish to parish, electrifying, bringing electricity to the countryside, and they used to build these Nissen huts where they used to all live. And there was one at the top of the village, and my grandfather bought it, and he used to rent it out to these traveling showmen. And these were guys who used to travel around the country with a tractor and a generator and a few cans of films. And they'd arrive in town, and they'd set up a projector in a hall, and they'd show Three Stooges shorts and Abbott and Costello shorts and Charlie Chaplin shorts to the populace. And they used to make a lot of money, and then they'd travel to the next town. And the one that used to come to Ireland was Billy Walsh's Talkies. And anyway, my father told me all these stories. This was back in the 40s. And my grandfather saw the money that he was making, that Billy Walsh used to make when he used to rent out his hall. So he thought, hey, I'm going to do this myself. So he opened a cinema and showed movies about 3 nights a week, but then quickly lost interest. And my father, because the family had no money left to live on, left school at the age of 12 and took over the cinema. So he built it up into a business where they were showing movies 7 nights a week. And then my father opened up another cinema in Kilmallock, which is on the Limerick-Cork border. And then in 1986, he opened up one of the first multiplexes in Ireland in Neenah. So my father was in the film industry from the age of 12 up until the age of 89. I believe he probably had the longest film career behind the camera in the world. So he started, my father joined the industry in 1942 and retired in 2002 when he sold the cinema in Neenah, which is still going. He sold it to the Omniplex Group about a month before COVID hit. So that was my background. So the film, but the cinema was always kind of a small affair, and it was a family affair, kind of like a family shop. So we were all forced to work in it, and me especially as the oldest boy. Fridays I get home from school at 3:45 and then get picked up and, driven to the cinema in Kilmallock, which is where I worked. That was kind of my alma mater, that cinema. I would work the 8 o'clock show and then the late show, and then the same on Saturday, except throwing a matinee, and the same on Sunday, and then back to school on Monday. But Friday mornings, Friday mornings I'd be in the classroom at 9 o'clock and I would just be trying to envisage in 12 hours time, I would be in this magical cinema, just this entirely different environment, dealing with adults smoking cigarettes and stuff. So it was a world that always intrigued me. My father was the ultimate film buff and just madly in love with movies. And I certainly inherited that gene. When I was going to school as a kid, I was always that kid. When the teacher asked us to write a composition, in primary school, the day I got attacked by an eagle or something, and we would have to write 1 page, I would go home and write 17 pages or whatever. And I was always told, Gleeson, you should be a writer. So I always knew wanted to do something artistic, even though I wasn't conscious of it. So I decided, I guess I'm going to be a writer. And then when I was about 12, Gone with the Wind was actually reissued in cinemas. I didn't really know a whole lot about it, and I went up to see it on a Monday night, and it just blew me away. So coming back to what you're saying, to your question, what specifically influenced me, I think I'm interested because I came to cinema at such a young, impressionable age, as opposed to people who come to it older in life, in college or whatever. I come at it from a more emotional angle as opposed to an intellectual angle. So what really moved me with Gone with the Wind was just the brash epicness, unabashed epic romanticism of it all. It's politics aside. I watched it again recently, and it's pretty much an ode to how much we miss slavery. I gravitate to that epic sweep, that romanticism, those big camera moves, big Max Steiner's epic score. Actually the movie Gone with the Wind, that was the movie that the credit production design was created specifically for that movie. Before that, that credit didn't exist. It was just art directors, and they hired the Cameron Menzies as the production designer, and decided, okay, well, we need to give him some special credit, so let's call him production designer. Yeah. But yeah, so that's the first movie that I saw where I really saw what a movie does. And I decided then that, I could combine what I was told I was good at with what I absolutely loved, which was movies. And that was such a huge revelation for me, So that took about, to put that into action, took about 25 years longer, of actually living, I guess, and having stuff to write about. I was the perfect age for a lot of those movies coming up. Like I was 11 when Star Wars hit, so I was exactly that demographic. And I think I was like 9 when Jaws hit, so, and 14 when the first Raiders came out, so I kind of grew up with the rise of Spielberg and everything, so I'm very much influenced by kind of commercial mainstream cinema, but also by because of my background, also being exposed accidentally, to Louis Malle movies, etc. I think I've got an unusual. I just draw from anything good, just appreciate talent in any form.
And your first foray, so, going from writing into, being a professional filmmaker and writing professionally, and then, even to working to an LA. So I was wondering if you can kind of like just take us through those steps, the steps of like maybe your first break, and then like an overview of, those beats that you're growing as an artist, you're gaining your first skill. Like, I mean, being in school and being a good writer is being a big fish in a small pond, and then going to like an industry over in like that's such a huge arc. And I was wondering, yeah, if I could just get a little bit more information about what those were. And was there ever a time as well that you kind of faltered and had to overcome anything as well on that?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. Yeah, and when I left school, there was zero. The closest to film school was a communications course in Rathmines in Dublin, and which I applied for and didn't get in. So basically, so there was zero film schools in Ireland. Or there wasn't. The film board didn't exist, and there was no support. So when I left school, I had to delay college for a couple of years and work in the business because my father's partner, his brother, passed away. So during the day, I worked in the civil service. I left school and joined the civil service. So during the day, I worked in that, in the Department of Agriculture. And many years later, when I met Cowboys and Angels, the main character worked at the Department of Agriculture, and we actually came back and shot at my desk, and lots of my co-workers were extras, which is something I recommend everyone try once in their life. That was an experience. And so I did many, many different jobs. And eventually, after 2 years, I studied communications in Scotland, just because it was I wanted to get far away from family, as you do at that age. And I felt I'd be trapped working in cinema forever if I didn't, get away. So I went to Scotland. I spent 2 years, and I got a degree, a diploma in communications, which I've never ever used. So I was in the northeast of Scotland, and I thought, okay, man, I got to make a movie. So I was in the oil capital of Europe. So I thought, okay, I can spend the next 3 years trying to hustle, trying to get money to make a short film, whatever, or I can work offshore in the oil industry in the North Sea for a year and save money. So 5 years later, I'm still offshore.
In the Arctic Circle, was it?
So yeah, I spent 5 years in the Arctic Circle. Sorry, in the North Sea and in the Arctic Circle, working. So I had saved some money. So I thought, okay, to hell with this. I need to freaking make a movie. Anyway, so I'm sitting offshore one day reading Empire magazine, and in the back there's an ad: write, shoot, direct, edit your own movies in our 6-week intensive course in New York City. So I went to New York City, and day one I met Natalie.
So she's, anyone who doesn't know, she's the producer from Wide Eye on this gorgeous film. So that's a relationship that was forged a long time ago. Amazing.
So yeah, Natalie Lickenthaler. So I met Natalie on day one, and we just became friends, and a shared interest in movies. We used to just hang out all the time, and we were on the same wavelength. And I pitched her Cowboys and Angels, which I actually shot a scene of at the New York Film Academy on this 6-week course. And I pitched her that, there's actually this is part of a bigger movie, that I want to do. And she said, "Oh, that sounds great. I want to produce that." I said, "How would you produce it? Have you ever produced anything?" And she said, "No." "Have you ever directed anything?" And I said, "No." So I said, okay, she can produce my movie. And anyway, so Natalie and I became a couple. We're now married with 4 kids. Yeah, so we formed Wide Eye Films together, and it was a long process. Happily, Screen Ireland had come about, or the Irish Film Board, as they were then. So we eventually managed to put Cowboys and Angels together after many, many drafts, and we learned the craft together of producing a movie. Although Natalie knows a hell of a lot more now. We started together, and I think she could probably do my job, but I look at what she does and I think, where did she learn this? Where did she learn all this? I was with her every step of the way, but yeah, she's pretty amazing. So anyway, we did Cowboys and Angels, and then my next movie was a thriller called The Front Line. And then the next movie I had after that was a huge science fiction movie, a huge time travel movie. And my agent at the time, my UK agent, didn't really know what to do with it. It'd be a huge step, to go from The Front Line, which was a $3 million movie, to this $200 million summer tentpole. The Front Line was an Irish, German, UK, Swedish co-production. And that's where Natalie is also very strong as a producer, because, she's got a foot here and she's also got a foot in Germany, and on the continent, which I think is crucial, to be connected, especially the way we put independent films together in Europe. But anyway, so the next movie I had was this $200 million sci-fi epic, and my agent at the time, she showed it to a colleague at CAA in Los Angeles, and anyway, I sold that movie to Sony Pictures, and that kind of launched me as a Hollywood screenwriter. So I worked on many different productions. I worked for Mattel, I worked for Sony, Fox, did a movie for Disney. So that led me down that kind of rabbit hole. And then I wrote Tolkien, and then I came back to directing in 2017.
So just in terms of working in LA, you'd be sort of working on original concepts or pitching original concepts, or would you be kind of called in to do development work on projects that are already in development? What were the type of gigs that you're being hired for, and the type of work that, and even the genre and things like that, where because that's a really interesting step to say, you had a really, really strong script. Yeah, it's so hard to raise that kind of capital, but as a result, you've now had a career where you're working in one of the most competitive, the most competitive space that we have, and making a living on it and working on it. And was that when you kind of moved there full time as well, or are you still at this point working from here? Describe to me a bit of what that was like.
Basically, yeah. So mine was a mix of both. With The End of History, as that project was called, we set it up with Neil Moritz, who produced the Fast and Furious movies. So it was with Sony Pictures through Neil Moritz's company, Original Films. So basically, how it works: if you have a spec screenplay that your agent believes in, they send it out to multiple producers who all have deals with various studios, and each of those producers will bring it into various studios at the same time. So the ideal scenario is you get people competing for it. So you get an auction scenario. So anyway, that's how it's supposed to work. So I basically did a mix of I sold that as a spec, and then I wrote, and I think I sold 3 scripts as specs, and then other projects would be stuff that your agent brings you. And for instance, one of them was the Hot Wheels movie, so they bring you that and they go, do you have a take on this? What would your take be on this? And then you go in and you pitch it. You pitch your take, what you would do. And you sit before a bunch of executives, they're all taking notes, and you kind of think to yourself, why are they writing all this down? And, so you either get the job or you don't. So that's how it works. But yeah, it's like you say, it's a very competitive environment. And likewise, writing is hard. It is the hardest job in the film industry, because you start on a blank page, Directing, you can always fall back. If you've got a really good DP, you can fall back as to, where to put the camera or whatever. Or you've an entire crew to support you, but if it's a really, really good solid script, as long as you keep everything in focus and everything in frame, you can't mess it up too badly. But, writing, you're on your own, you're alone, and your words are black and white on a page. You can't hide behind a nice font, so it is that kind of an industry. But yeah, so I worked in all different kind of genres, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage, because it's easier for your career and for your agents to market you if you're the thriller guy, or if you're the horror guy, or if you're the romantic love story guy. So I did even with my films that I've done here, Cowboys and Angels is kind of a teen, kind of colorful coming of age movie. The Front Line is a thriller. Don't Go is a bank heist thriller. Don't Go is a psychological drama, a psychological thriller. And Once Upon a Time is, I'm not sure what it is really. I'm too
Like a warm, nostalgic, heartfelt drama, I think.
So they're all very different. The movies I worked on in LA, I did a movie called Red Giant for Mattel and Fox, which is based on a Mattel game called Red Giant, and that was really hardcore sci-fi. For Disney, I did a movie called The Grimm Legacy, which is kind of a Harry Potter-esque IP that they own. So I did that. Remains in development. But what spurred me to move to LA was I did Tolkien. So I was always fascinated by Lord of the Rings. I had read the books when I was a student, as did most people. I was always fascinated, not so much by the actual narrative, but which I love, but by the guy who wrote it. I thought, who the hell wrote this? This is amazing. And so I immediately picked up a Tolkien biography. And so that was always in my head, Tolkien's story. And when I was on one of my visits to LA before I had moved there, I met an executive and we were talking about Lord of the Rings. And I said, well, it's not Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Why did they call it Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings? It's Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So someone needs to get some more of that Lord of the Rings money. And he said, how would you do that? And I said, well, make a movie about Tolkien. And he said, so what would that be? And this is a casual conversation. I didn't realize I was pitching the movie. So I pitched the movie, and the next day he texted me saying, we should do that movie, etc. But then that kind of fell by the wayside. But I ended up working on that outline anyway. And I sent it into Screen Ireland for development. And they turned it down for development. You win some, you lose some, with Screen Ireland. That's the way it works. I mean, they can't support everything, but they turned it down for development. And then literally the next day, I got a phone call from Fox Searchlight who wanted to buy it.
Stop. That's kind of weirdly fortuitous, isn't it?
Totally. So,
Not to rag on Screen Ireland, but I'm sure you got a few more bob from Fox if it's like
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was kind of a blessing and a curse, and it was in the sense that I really wanted to direct that movie, but when it's unless you have Screen Ireland support in Ireland, it's very, very difficult to make an independent movie because you can't really go to funders in other countries if Ireland isn't behind you first, you being Irish, So I was kind of forced to relinquish that project.
And that's interesting there. So yeah, so you kind of had to give that to another director. But the other jobs, the franchises, the projects that you worked on, they're always going to go to another director. Is that hard? Is it fine? Like, do you kind of, I mean, is it that Tolkien was something that was so kind of close to your own heart from the beginning that it's yours and you have to let it go, but everything else, you're always doing it for that thing? Like, what's your attitude to it? Or are you just delighted when you get to put your hands on your own work and kind of see it to fruition?
Yeah. When I sold Tolkien, there wasn't a director attached. Usually when I'm writing something, there isn't a director attached. I don't think I've ever worked closely with a director. So usually there isn't a director attached, but, I know enough about the industry. You can't be precious about this. When you're hired as a writer, you don't want to be that person that dilutes your own success with saying, yes, but I also want to direct. You don't want to be that guy. So you either have to just develop your own movies and get them made yourself, or just consistently write movies that gross $800 million, and eventually you get to direct one of those movies.
But once upon a time in the cinema, you're writing these big fantastical stories in these fantasy realms, in the like in fun action IP aimed at kids, dark psychological thrillers, and then something like this that feels very close to home. I know as writers we always kind of put ourselves into things, but we don't, like where that is fine. We get to decide and be very quiet about how much is true and then how much is that fictionalized version of it. Like, when did that begin as an idea in this journey?
That began, I always remember it actually. It began during COVID. I was driving down, actually, it's Soundsaw, Hollywood.
So a year after your dad sold the cinema, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. But it had always been in my head that, it's, I guess they say write about what you know, and the thing that I know best is what's in that movie, is what it means to hang out in the cinema. So I always did really want to make a movie set in and around the cinema, but I never knew how to do it. And, anything set within a 5-mile radius of a cinema immediately gets plastered with Cinema Paradiso. And I just got such a brilliant payoff, and that movie, where he watches all the clips, spoiler alert, that I thought, how could you ever top that, And my father loved that movie. That was kind of his story. Every time I thought about doing that movie, I just came back to Cinema Paradiso and thought, how could you do that? So I was in LA, actually, driving down Sunset Boulevard, listening to a podcast with Quentin Tarantino, who was talking about his book, Cinema Speculation. And he's just talking about movies and going to the cinema and everything. And it just clicked into place. How about a movie set in a cinema during a movie? So immediately that's it ties into kind of what I'm good at. If there's anything that links everything I've done together, it's kind of an engaging concept. So that was immediately a concept that I could get excited about. And then it came together relatively fast. The screenplay, I was able to write it. It just flowed out of me, but I still had to do about 32 drafts. It's usually you think, maybe this is the one time I'll write a script and it'll be perfect and like we can just shoot it, but that never happens. It's always at least a year and many, many drafts. So even though that movie happened pretty fast, we went to Screen Ireland and they turned us down for development. And then we worked on it further and we moved back and then they came on board. So the lesson there is be resilient, if you believe in it, don't give up, So no matter what, you can never just coast. You always have to keep fighting.
Yeah. And what were the changes then in the drafts between those two? Because I think that's interesting in terms of, like someone who's as accomplished. I think it's also good for the rest of us to know that someone as accomplished as you do still at this level face rejection in some beats, and it's just a case of, dusting off, going back, revisiting it, going again. And I suppose as well, like in terms of you don't know what's in the round that you're applying for, and like there might be things with two similar themes, and it isn't always like a personal thing about that work, but it just is where it sits in a slate as well for that description. But going back to reassess it and on that draft journey, maybe actually is probably more of a general scope that's more interesting, is what changed since the first idea popped into your head in terms of characters, in terms of pacing. What were the big leaps for the different drafts?
When we first started developing this, it was actually called One Night Only. But there's a big movie coming out during the summer called One Night Only, and they'll probably have a bigger marketing budget than us. We changed it to Once Upon a Time in a Cinema, which is actually a far better title. I'm so happy we did. Yeah, basically the way I work, I kind of work from the character-wise, and a movie set in the cinema, that it's an interesting concept, but it has to be a character journey, so it's clearly a very character-driven film. And the way I kind of work is from the outside in, as opposed to the inside out, as opposed to coming up with a character and, then working out the narrative from that character. I kind of come up with concept first and get that framework in place, and then kind of find the characters within. And it's kind of a more cumbersome process. And also, what was a challenge with this movie is because it's set in real time, pretty much over 90 minutes, and because all of the most engaging movies, the movies that resonate, are movies where a character changes, where, you know, a character is one person at the end, at the beginning, and another person at the end. These are the movies that resonate, and these are the movies that I love. And why, as humans, we're attracted to character arcs, I don't know. That's a deep theological question, you know, but we love to see people change. So that was a challenge. How do you bring a character to the edge and have him be reborn in a credible way over 90 minutes in a freaking cinema, you know? So basically the process through many drafts and working with a great script editor called Julie O'Leary, who I have to credit as well. She really helped guide me. Yeah, is finding a credible character who you can get behind in a realistic way. And the thing with writing, which I always find, is you work on many scripts, and you learn a lot, so you have a lot to draw on in your bank. But every new project that you start, nothing that you ever learned or ever did in any of those other projects seems to ever apply to this one that you're writing now. So I always just feel totally lost, with every project, because of the way Screen Ireland development is structured, and also media development. You kind of do get railroaded into working with script editors. And I love working with script editors who are kind of like Formula One mechanics. They wouldn't be able to drive the Formula One car, but they can fix it, whereas the driver wouldn't be able to fix it. They can tell you what's wrong. And the way I look at it is kind of fast track development, because the conclusions that you come to working with a script editor, you would probably eventually come to those conclusions working on your own, but it might take you 3 years, whereas with a script editor, you can reach that much faster. So when I'm writing, I try to solicit as much feedback as possible, because the one thing you do realize when you've met a few movies is the weekend it's released, everyone's got an opinion anyway. So you might as well get them when you're writing it, and then you can address them, But it was a challenge doing such a character-based movie.
Yeah, and it's also an ensemble piece. And then you also have arcs, that you have to kind of set up, seed through, and conclude, in terms of the cinema itself is a character, the community itself is a character, the general arc of that. And then you've all of these individual smaller characters that all have arcs. Even when you nail that for the script, was that then also hard to nail for the edit? To give everyone time, and then to have time for a central character to go through that huge ideological shift.
Yeah, it was, there's, you write your movie 3 times. You write it at script stage, and then when you shoot it, it gets rewritten again. Sometimes the way a character raises his eyebrow in one scene can make the next 2 scenes redundant, it's not in the script. And then in the editing, you're constantly amazed by, you see things that your actors did that you didn't see in the shoot, that changed that again. And even stuff that extras are doing in the background can shift the focus, so that you want to see more of that. But no, the script was a very, very tight script, and it was, we shot this in 20 days, even though I don't like to advertise that, because then it becomes as, how fast you shot it.
No, but it's a period piece, and again, there's so many moving parts with a lot of extras, and yeah, a lot of arcs to kind of set up and conclude, and technology, and detailed production design, and very rich, decided lighting. That sounds hard. Well done.
Yeah, the trick to doing that in 20 days is a great first AD, and we had a great one in our Belgian first AD, Marcus Himberg. And also, though, because I meticulously prepare, and I mean meticulously, every single shot in this was storyboarded, everything, two-way conversations back and forth, every cut was storyboarded. And I did that months in advance. And then I was able to break down, work out from the storyboards how many setups were in each scene, and and that was even on the call sheet. So we were able to break it down and structure the shoots so that we never had more than like 17 setups a day in theory. So everything was meticulously prepared. But having said that, on the shoot, you can't be a slave to those storyboards. Everything, things often change, but at least you have a plan and you can sleep the night before. I could never walk onto a set and ask, okay, where should we put the camera? That was all thought out a long time in advance. So meticulous preparation, but also be prepared to improvise on the fly.
Oh God! And then finally, so your Irish or world premiere at TIFF?
That was the world
The
premiere.
world premiere. So that was So like again, that was a kind of the opening film of TIFF.
Yeah, which was so nice. Yeah.
Something that has sort of been in the works for about 6 years. Did people take away what you wanted to take away? What has the reception been like so far? Because we sent our reviewer Peter to it, and he's gonna more off that era, and he just said it was so authentic and loved that energy of it.
Yeah. No, that was lovely. Yeah. No, it's lovely to hear that feedback. And people are very moved by it, And it's weird because I never considered it a period piece, or I didn't set out to make a nostalgic movie. I just, made a movie by the time that I could write with authority and speak of with authority. But you realize, wow, that is a long time ago, But people are very moved, very emotionally engaged by it. And, which is so gratifying. And also the thing that's really, really nice, I guess, and what unites audiences is people really do have such an emotional connection to cinemas, I kind of thought I was the only one. Well, I didn't think I was the only one, but I didn't think there was as many of us. And even younger people, who would have been born in the mid-90s or even the 2000s, seem to have this genetic connection even to that period, I think it's a product of, I guess, the times we live in now, where those kind of social spaces and those deep human connections and interactivities are getting scarcer, So to see a time that was less corporatized and, I guess a little bit freer in terms of behavior, everyone is smoking in the cinema, is gratifying to people, and kind of comforting. It's so nice to see that reaction and to see that people really are moved by that. And for me, that's what it's all about, is engaging people emotionally. Yeah.
And it certainly does that. And it's certainly one to capture in the cinema as well, if anyone gets a chance. And thank you so much for chatting with us. 100%. Go see it, because it's just like, it is a joyous love letter, but it's also just a really enjoyable, character-driven narrative that, you're immersed on the journey.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for listening. So make sure to subscribe to Film Ireland wherever you get your podcasts.